Brilliant. So hello everybody, thank you again for joining us for the beginning of month 2 of the Celebrating Disability webinar series. I'm really excited to be here, and again Sarah Burrell is joining us, so thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
And also we have our captionist Layla, who is here to take some closed captions for us, which is really cool as well. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking about just some general disability awareness. So kind of the way I describe general disability awareness is like, it's an overview of what you in an organization would want to start thinking about when beginning your disability awareness and disability inclusion and equality journey within the workplace. So today, hopefully, we'll give you a taster of the type of things that you would need to think about when thinking about how to be inclusive of disabled people in the workplace, and the reasons why it's really important as well. As you know, this webinar is just a taster of the sort of things that Sarah and I would be working with you on if you decided to work with a disability consultant with Celebrating Disability or with Sarah Burrell Inclusion. So it's not meant to give you all the answers that you'll need to be inclusive of disabled people at all. So please don't go away thinking that you'll know everything, because you won't. As you know, just to have some general housekeeping, if you haven't been to these before, what I would ask you to do, unless it's for your access requirement purposes, is to stay away from the chat box, because for Sarah and I, access requirement purposes, it's really hard to keep an eye on the chat box and to have that conversation as well. We are disabled people ourselves, so we're thinking about how we can best engage and be active in this conversation, bearing in mind our access requirements. So yeah, if you could stay away from that, if at all possible, that would be brilliant. However, there is a Q&A box at the bottom that if you want to ask any questions, we'd love your questions. Put them in there, and then we'll easily be able to like see your questions and answer them. If you have to leave, which I hope you don't, there's a button on the bottom right that says leave, to which you can do. Yeah, and then 72 hours after this event, I will send you the recording of the session along with a feedback form. So if you wouldn't mind clicking the link onto the feedback, it really just helps me to know what's working well, what's not working so well, and also what you would like to hear about in the future. I've had a really good few kind of ideas of what people want to hear, including mental health webinars, so webinars on how to support people with mental health in the workplace, which I think would be really good, and it's Sarah's expertise, so that would be really good. For that, we'd hand over to her, and I'd be like, I'll just sit here and just listen. So I think that would be really good. So if you do have any suggestions, if it doesn't seem as though we're doing anything just now, we do have them kind of in the back of our mind to put on at a later date. But with that in mind, I'm going to get going. So first of all, I'm just going to show you a quick slide on what we are going to cover in today's session. So today we will be covering the importance of disability awareness and the distinction between awareness and inclusion. We'll be talking a little bit about the breadth of disability, so that you can understand that disability isn't just one thing, that actually it covers a massive spectrum of things, and there's a massive reason for that as well. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that disabled people, customers and candidates might face when entering the workplace, and what you can do as organisations to begin to think about mitigating that. We're going to have a little look at terminology and etiquette, and what you can and can't say to disabled people, and what you should be thinking about when engaging and communicating with disabled people. As usual, we've got some action points for you, and then we've got a Q&A section. So if you do have any questions, as I said before, we would love to hear them. So I'm going to start to talk about a little bit about the importance of disability awareness. So the way I distinguish it, and if please come in at any point, Sarah, and give your kind of thoughts on this. The way I kind of talk about it with people is that I think awareness is passive, sorry. So awareness is really useful because unless we develop our awareness, there's nothing that we can do to change things. So we need to be aware that there are barriers for disabled people. We need to be aware of our unconscious biases. And we need to be aware that there's things that we can do to mitigate these barriers and these biases, but then we need to do something about it. So awareness is, as I said, it's passive. So we can come to a webinar or a training session and think, oh, that was so good. Essie and Sarah was so engaging. I really liked it when Essie did this. She was wearing a really nice top. And what she was talking about there was really interesting. Now I'm going to go back to my job. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. And you're not going to do anything because you become aware, but that's it. Whereas being inclusive of disabled people is taking all of that same information and then thinking that was really interesting. I can see where I can begin to implement, maybe immediately, maybe over a long term, some of these strategies into my workplace. And I can see where these attitudes are creating barriers to disabled people feeling included. And I can see what I can do about it. So being active about inclusion is thinking about what we can do going forward and changing the course. Would you agree with that, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, completely. And actually, the being active doesn't always mean massive steps. It can be small steps. And actually, the biggest step of all actually is realising and recognising that there's a difference between awareness and inclusion. That step is one many people don't really get. And actually, if we can harness awareness and link it up with actionable points and quite a simple step perhaps, we realise how behaviour and mindset impact our ability to be inclusive and how we can adapt little steps often to try and mitigate that. And the most difficult part of that is admitting you don't know. Because that's the most powerful phrase in a boardroom. I don't know, please tell me more, rather than assuming that you're supposed to know and then not having a clear action plan because your thoughts on it are vague.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I'd like to say that when I was planning these webinars, I had a clear kind of path of what was coming next to lead on to the other ones, but I wasn't. But I think that this really nice, it comes in at a really nice stage because we've been talking about a lot of things that you've summed up in previous webinars. So for example, when we were talking about inclusive design and accessible design, a lot of what you've just said relates very well to kind of why inclusion is so important and why it's important to recognize that we don't have all the answers, but then be okay with not having all the answers. And I think a really good example, a tangible example that people can grasp hold of is unconscious bias. So we all have unconscious biases, and it's okay to admit that we have those unconscious biases, but once we do recognize them and they're not unconscious anymore, it's about doing something about it. So the awareness comes from realizing that they're there. The action and the inclusion comes from then doing something about it.
And the transferability from theory into action there is so important. And a lot of us understand, we all have bias for a reason. We all have reason, originally it was bias for
protection and safety.
Yeah, survival, And as we become more developed as a society, we input bias in our teaching, our understanding, our the way of life, and it's not an easy thing to mitigate. You're actually changing a belief system from a child. That's a huge step, and we can do little things, incremental things to help that along the way. By, for example, we can set value-based behaviours that we want to see, and that alone gives them guidance on, okay, so in this situation, what am I supposed to think or do? And having a almost core value associative behaviour one pager, for example, can really help guide that behavioural change while it's happening. And it's not going to be an immediate fix. It will never be immediate. It's always going to take work. But it's important we do put in that work.
I agree. And with that in mind, I think it's a great kind of link to talking about the breadth of disability. Yeah. So Disability in the Equality Act 2010 is deliberately a wide spectrum, because I think that we're beginning to recognise, and we're recognising more and more, that it's not a specific thing, a disability. So with that in mind, though, there are a few categories that help us to think about disability as a big scope. So those categories are a physical impairment, a mental health impairment, a learning disability or impairment, a sensory impairment, and then autism and neurodiverse. And some people get confused, muddled a little bit in the middle when it comes to mental health and learning disability. Some people get confused between whether a learning disability and mental health is the same thing, because head mental, and that confuses people. And also people don't quite understand a lot of the time that neurodiverse and autism isn't a learning disability, but neurodiverse and autism is separate to a learning disability.
Can I add one on the end there? I know
that's why I paused.
I know you were thought of this, but it's in case you've got long-term health conditions.
Absolutely.
A long-term health condition can impact greatly on someone's ability to perform day-to-day tasks. Is legally classified as a disability. So, yeah.
You're absolutely right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for making that distinction. And I think it's also, I mean, and that's a really good point you made. Thank you very much. That actually, when we're summing up disability, and this is why, in training sessions, I said we need to be aware of kind of these categories, but then we need to forget them. Because it's not, being inclusive of disability is not about thinking about a specific person's impairment. It's thinking about somebody holistically. So for example, we're both physically disabled, but our access requirements and our needs and our personalities are very different. So for example, although I'm not a full-time wheelchair user in the workplace, I pretty much am a full-time wheelchair user. You're not a wheelchair user. I don't have a speech impairment. So you do have a speech impairment. Yeah. There are certain things that you can do that I can't physically, and vice versa. And so it's very, very important that whilst we are aware that disability is a massive spectrum, that we remember that we're not looking at the disability, we're looking at the ability and what we can do to support that person to be included, and that everybody is unique, and also that disability is intersectional. So by that, I mean, just because somebody might have a physical impairment doesn't also mean they might not be struggling with some kind of mental health. So for example, depression, or bipolar or something, and they may not also have a long-term health condition, and so on and so forth. And also with that intersectionality, just because that person is then disabled doesn't mean that they don't really care about X, Y, and Z. And then they're not really talented at that. And then they don't want to grow in the workplace by doing a degree, or they don't want to do this extracurricular activity. So it's about remembering that people are holistic beings, and we don't fit into just one certain category.
I think it's important to mention actually above that that inclusive steps don't necessarily benefit only disabled people. Inclusive steps are just that. They are trying to make attitudes, mindset, and environment more inclusive for everyone, and everyone can find benefit from engagement, from a flexible working pattern, from it's a universally good thing to engage, to ask questions, to open up as a person who has disability and impairment to what works for them. It's not as categorical as it may first appear to be.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that one of the reasons I didn't mention it perhaps is, for me, it's an obvious, isn't it? But it's not obvious for everyone that, and I wrote a blog about it last month, that actually by being inclusive of just in this example, a physically disabled person, by putting in a ramp and taking out those staircases, or putting in a ramp beside the staircases, doesn't mean that non-disabled person or that non-wheelchair user can't get to the front door. But it also means that the wheelchair user can get to the front door.
Levels the playing field.
Yeah, exactly. It levels the playing field, and actually it might make it easier for more than one person. I know that our colleague Ryan always talks about, for example, lifts in department stores. They're helpful for wheelchair users, but they're also helpful for the internal staff for moving boxes around and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah.
But obviously that's one example of a physical impairment of a wheelchair user. There are many more examples that support other impairment groups. So, for example, clear signage, for example. Another one of our colleagues who has dyspraxia always talks about clear signage in shops. And actually, it helps him with his dyspraxia. But why wouldn't it help somebody else that doesn't know their way around the shop?
Yeah. And by catering to one need, it may appear at first sight niche to cater to, but as you said, you realise the benefit outside the group to actually, this is useful for everyone too. And that's the case with so many things that people wouldn't immediately think to go to. And this is why it's important to actually talk to people, engage with people about being aware of of impairment, or being aware of what we can do to resolve or problem solve, so that person can equally thrive and equally go through our develop in an equal and fair way.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like what we're going to talk about next, Sarah, because you're making all these seamless links. It's perfect. So do you want to kick us off by talking about why it's important to recognise that there are barriers for disabled people, and then a little bit about what some of those barriers are?
Yeah, cool. I can think why it's important to recognise was a big one. I mean, I guess...
Yeah, in 5 minutes, please.
Okay. I think the importance comes in at where there's uncomfort in there's uncomfort and unease in a organizational ethos about wanting to be inclusive but being unsure what to do, and therefore the uncertainty can quickly turn to avoidance or even assumption that it will be too difficult to do that, so we won't even go there. And so it's important, and awareness of it is important to open mindset up to the often very simple steps that can make a workplace inclusive. It doesn't always take a big budget. It doesn't always take a redesign of the whole establishment. It can be a lot more simple when we make it up with that people make it up to be, and not knowing and not acknowledging or not being aware will be that cut-off point. And why not become aware? Why not become more savvy? And when people approach, for example, my speech impairment, for example, I have quite a significant speech impairment, and it puts people in, if I haven't met them before, it puts them in a really uneasy position, and I'm lucky enough to be able and willing to articulate that it's okay to ask me again. It's okay to ask me to repeat. I'd rather you do that than not hear me. And I've had a series of interviews where I've seen the barrier go down so fast when people initially hear me speak. And I have to bring that barrier up really fast in making a joke about it. Because actually, humour is a great way of breaking through that barrier. But the clawing back into the room takes so much energy that if people were aware of that and were more in tune with how to act and what to say and what in a very clear, confident way, that can enable a conversation to happen. Wouldn't happen if we didn't have the tools on clear, confident, active engagement, and those tools to be able to have a conversation about it, actively engage, put little actions into place, and come out better for everyone. It's little things, adjustments that can be made through engaging with that person.
Sorry.
I'm drifting away from the point, but
no, you're not. I was going to add to your point. I mean, I think I completely agree, and I think that that's a really good example of an overt barrier that becomes a subtle barrier if it's not dealt with. So I'm thinking about what happens as a result of people not feeling confident to say, actually, do you mind repeating yourself, and shying away from that. So eventually, I know that you when you're happy to advocate and talk about that, but for people who are not, that really can shake somebody's confidence, that can stop them in future from going for a job interview, that can stop them in future from engaging. So in a very kind of glib kind of summing up way, without having time to go into a lot of detail, that means for the organization that they're losing out on all of that talent, all of that skill, all of that diverse knowledge that they wouldn't otherwise get if they looked into their, their personal barriers, or perhaps confidence, or perhaps talking and saying, actually, would you mind repeating yourself, and those kind of things. So I think that some of these barriers, they have like an obvious immediate impact, but it's the subtle long-term impacts that prevent people from being able to move forward, and prevent disabled people from being part of the workplace, and prevent organizations from harnessing that skill and that experience that comes from disabled people.
And just to add to that a little bit more, I think the point that comes up time and time again is inclusion and diversity are kind of buzzwords, and a lot of the lip service goes on throughout organizations about how important being inclusive and diverse is, but not knowing how to respond to that, and what our job, what our work in essence, it supports people and guides people to be confident, to know exactly what to ask, exactly how to ask it, and how to get a solution that works for you and that person. So it goes from a vague lip service comment to actionable steps to change X, Y, Z, which will in the future become embedded, which then improves the organizational stance, and therefore attracts more diverse talent.
Absolutely.
Not only attracts them, but involves them, includes them actively, as you were saying, an active process. We are all learning as we go, and it's fine to still keep learning. But actually, we're all learning all the time, and we won't ever come to an end. But it's good to be open enough about this to actually want to create actionable steps to mitigate these issues without fear and without stigma around it.
I agree. As always, these subjects could literally go on all day, because I actually, I'm glad that we talked about this side of barriers, but I also wanted to touch upon, so I'm just going to touch upon them really quickly before we move on, the external barriers. So the external barriers that are external to the workplace environment. So when people are thinking about what they can put in to literally support people to enter the building, they sometimes think about lifts and automatic doors and hearing loops and all of those things. But what organizations don't think about is how that disabled person got to the workplace in the first place. So if, through no fault of people's own, when they're working in central London, a lot of London is old. So it's quite inaccessible for disabled people. So thinking about physical disability for a second, your building might be really physically accessible, but if it's not accessible outside, then that creates a challenge for the disabled people. It's not always things that organizations can immediately do about it, and it's not obvious answers, but there are ways, depending on the size of the organization and the influence organizations have, that they can influence positive change in the outer world. Equally, for hidden disabilities, perhaps sensory disabilities or mental health or autism and neurodiverse, it's about society and managing through society to get to that workplace in the first place, without even thinking about kind of the attitudes, which are a big thing, but thinking about, public transport in rush hour, and managing that public transport, both physically and emotionally as well, can be quite difficult. I wish we had more time to kind of delve into that, because it's a massive subject. But, if you bought a session, That's what you get. So we have some kind of scenarios that Sarah and I, and again, if we were running a training session, I would turn this into a discussion with the group. So the group would actually discuss these. But for the purposes of time, Sarah and I are going to go through kind of some of these scenarios. So Sarah, is it okay if I ask you the first one?
Yeah.
And then you answer, and then vice versa.
Yeah.
So we have kind of a communication scenario. So it's a true or false, which is obviously a closed question, but then you can open it out into an open question afterwards. So true or false, when talking to somebody with a speech impairment, if you cannot understand them after 3 attempts, you should attempt to change the subject.
False.
Oh, really? I'm surprised. Please explain. I'm not surprised, just so that people don't know. I'm not surprised. Please explain.
I just remembered I forgot to premise as well. I had a speech impairment, and all right to ask me to repeat. I prefer that.
More than 3 times.
That little bit I forgot to do at the start, but I think that it's such a it can be such a pressurized situation on both sides of a conversation. If the circumstances are not perfect to be able to understand someone or understand someone with a speech impairment, that if I get asked to repeat under a stressful environment, my voice will kind of worsen, if you like, with the fear of not being understood. But the trying to change topic, I've had experience this, obviously, and you can see it in people's eyes how engaged they feel or how scared they are about the situation. And we all have responsibility to advocate, and if we are able to and willing to, because actually if you ask me to repeat it twice and I don't get it out the 3rd time or 4th time, that puts pressure on both sides of the conversation. And we can disperse this pressure by saying, you know what, I'm so sorry. I know you tried 4 times, but I'm still having trouble hearing you. Would you mind if we try that somewhere else? Or is there anything I can do to support this? That immediately lowers the pressure through acknowledging it and being aware of it, purely through acknowledging the situation. That can in itself calm a situation down enough to be like, of course, you know what, I'm really out of my depths in here, that would be great to go outside and have a chat. And that's okay, you know, and it's all right to bring in the truth. If someone can't understand you and you won't be heard, there's 2 battles going on. And so it's a challenge on both sides, but it's a challenge we as responsible and, you know, definitely in the workplace, we must learn to do that and create a level of comfort surrounding that, and being okay that you have communication issue, but knowing how to support you when they do have difficulties.
No, I completely agree. And being on the, you know, being the listener of a person with a speech impairment, it's really, is it okay for me to say this? It's really awkward for me if I don't understand. You're not my only colleague or friend who has a speech impairment, but sometimes I mishear what you say and I miss what my other colleagues say as well. And it's really, I have tried it before where I said, oh yeah, no, I know what you're saying, let's move on. And then it's very obvious that I didn't, because, you know, I changed the subject and they're asking me a question and I've been just like, yeah. And they've asked me, you know, did you like that murder scene yesterday? And I'm like, yeah, you know, that kind of thing. Obviously a movie. So from the person without the speech impairment point of view, it only worsens that engagement and that contribution. And actually, if I was the person with a speech disorder, speech impairment, sorry, it would lower my respect for that person over time.
And especially when you are quite forthcoming and prepared, that you set it up, because actually, you know, there might be miscommunication or misunderstanding when you do say what I say. For example, like, I will say, please ask me to repeat it and understand me. I do that a lot with people I don't know, because I want to get that awkward, dispel a little bit of that awkwardness. But if you do that, and the first conversation starts off that, and they don't respect that, what you've just said, that can dishearten more.
Yeah.
Because you have prepared, you have set them up, because you want them to interact with you.
Yeah.
When awareness turns into inclusiveness, that is a great example of what a distinction of, you know, what one can be and the other one can't be. So.
Absolutely. Right, let's do another one. Can you ask me this time?
Of course. So is it okay to say, I'll do it for you, to a person perceives the struggling?
So for me, I don't think it is okay. It's not okay. For me, as somebody who is always perceived to be struggling, with these webinars, I sit in a chair and you might see my arms move around a lot, but you don't see the full extent of my physical disability. I have very limited dexterity in my hands, so I am always perceived to be struggling. And I enjoy the struggle because it means that I'm doing what I want to do independently. And if I can't do it, I won't do it. So when people quite often come up to me, strangers have run over to me on a train, and you know, when I'm pulling my sleeves down, by biting my sleeves and pulling it, they ran over to me on the train and said, I'll do it for you. And it's very hard to me to remain calm and not say, F off, get off me, because as I've just explained, it's part of my identity. It's really, really important to me to be as independent as possible. For me personally, and I am talking from personal experience, for me personally, what's most important to me is remaining autonomous and independent in my life. And so I'd rather struggle around finding a situation that works than not. And even saying that, even when I'm not struggling, it looks like I am because of what I explained about my limited dexterity. And I think in general, when you make those assumptions and take the choice away from people, you're reaffirming the societal belief that disabled people can't do for themselves and they need things doing for them. So a good alternative, so I would say it's never okay to say, I'll do it for you. I think a good alternative to that, perhaps you would like to say, if you would like any support, please let me know. I'm happy to support you. Not saying, can I help you? Because that person might not need help. And that again is making the assumption that they can't do it themselves. And as Sarah and I have discussed before, there's a very big difference between help and support. Help being taking it off somebody, supporting somebody being assisting them to do it their own way. but letting that person know that you're there to support them if they would like it. Quite often, again, from a personal point of view, I might say, I'm okay at the moment, thank you. But in a minute, if I'm still stuck, I might turn to you to ask you to help, because I know then it's there. And I don't have to make that first move to say to somebody, I don't know how they're going to react. Can you support me to do this, please?
Even more basic, for me, I'm not a wheelchair either, but I have mobility issues, and for me, the best question that I'm asked, or the best question that I advise people to ask in the opposite end is, do you require assistance? And rather making the assumption that someone does, and so I mean, I like what Essie said, like the being open to future assistance. That's great. But if you want to know if someone needs assistance, ask, do you require assistance? You'll get an answer. And then it lifts it can lift the assumption or tension that someone needs this or want, or will only get there if we help them. It's not like that. And by empowering people, we empower people through choice and not through assumption. And that's that's my 2 cents on that.
I completely agree, and I think just very quickly before we move on to the actions points, I think when I'm delivering training, a lot of the concerns that people in the room have is that they've had this experience before where they've offered somebody support and that person has yelled at them. And I always say, and again, this is my personal opinion, I think that sometimes for people that comes from, for disabled people, that comes from an exhaustion, a fatigue of those assumptions happening all the time. Okay. So for that person that said, this is why I don't talk, they don't offer help, that's the first time that they've come across that situation. But for that disabled person on the receiving end, that's probably the 5th time that day, or even in that hour. So it becomes this state of, I can't cope with this anymore. I'm so frustrated that unfortunately I've taken my frustrations out on the person in front of me, which isn't that disabled person's intention, but it's that only way of releasing that energy. So I would say that you should never, if you've had a bad experience, that's one bad experience out of 7 billion people, I would never refrain from offering that support with the appropriate language again in the future. Because again, as a disability advocate and a disability professional, I think that it's my responsibility to act in a generous way, in a way that shows people that I appreciate them. So I say thank you very much, but no thank you this time. But thank you for asking me, so that people know that, it's not a bad thing to offer that support.
And keeping, I think we discussed it in previous webinars, but the importance on knowing that the reserves are not always there, and when we face 10 people asking the same question, be it assumptions or be it otherwise, there will be a point in everyone's lives actually where they cannot really handle that anymore. Yeah. Unfortunately, because we are asked by the public a lot of the time, because we don't know, it can drain to be nice and responsive rather than reactive. But we have to remember we're all human, and unfortunately, that is not always the ideal situation for that person. Isn't always the case. And please do keep in mind that can happen, and it's unfortunate, but please don't be discouraged in interacting or engaging, because you've experienced that from a person who has an impairment, who's probably exhausted and hasn't got time or hasn't got energy to deal with that question appropriately.
Absolutely. And kind of just circling back to what we were saying before, disabled people, like everybody else, we're holistic beings that have other things to do. So we're not just in that one place for the day, like a teacher who people perceive to be in that closet until the parent needs them. You know, we might be heading somewhere, or we might have just had an interaction that might be positive or negative that impacts on how then we interact with the next person. I'm just going to move on to action points because I want time for questions if people have any. So we have 3 action points for you today, and they're quite big ones. So, I mean, I don't want them to seem overwhelming or anything. And again, if you do have any follow-up after this, please do reach out to me. But so the first action point is, what can you do to champion disability inclusion in your workplace for disabled employees, customers, and disabled candidates? So that doesn't have to be a massive thing that you do. It might just be being an ally for somebody and thinking about the fact that disability is a wide spectrum. It might be showing your team that you are compassionate and supportive, to listen when they need to talk, because you don't know what's going on. Many people have hidden disabilities that they don't want to talk about, that they don't recognize as such, but having that person to listen to might just be what somebody needs to talk on that day. So it could be a very small thing. It could be about reminding people about asking about access requirements in meetings or events and things like that. It doesn't have to be a massive strategic change, although it can be. So number 2, what else do you need to know? Where can you find out the answers? So obviously this was a very kind of very brief overview on a massive subject. Hopefully this has given you some sparks that make you think, oh, you know, there's other things I need to learn. So have a think about what those things are. What are the burning questions? Where can you find the answers? It might be through a disability consultant. It might be through looking at certain things on Twitter and LinkedIn. It might be about reading certain articles. It might be about just talking to colleagues and friends, but what else? And what small changes can you influence to make your workplace more inclusive for disabled people? So that could be attitude inclusiveness. So how can you make sure that disabled people feel part of that workplace culture and be inclusive? How can they I can't think of the word. How can they get the most out of an interview that they're going to? How can they tell you that they're the best candidate for the job? How can your disabled customer ensure that they have the best experience when they use your products and services? And those are the those are the action points that we would like you to take from today. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions they would like to ask us.
Anyone?
I think again we've covered everything, Sarah. You give people a few minutes, because often it happens that actually just before we close there's a question.
Yeah, of course.
Is there anything that you're thinking about?
Me?
Yeah.
I think the most powerful thing you can do to initially kind of change things is asking open questions about what you don't know, and showing that in itself demonstrates a want for a meaningful answer and a want to actively change things. So asking open questions and engaging with anyone can be the first step to this inclusion journey, and actually that can be the most crucial step, to hearing what other people are thinking,
Mm.
and how you, as an organisation, you can support them, and that demonstrates care. It demonstrates that as an organisation, you do not take for granted what people are doing for you or working with, and by being open and reflective, that's a way in to open up the conversation, and you shouldn't be afraid of asking those questions.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree, and you know, and to add to that, kind of then having a plan afterwards. So you know, so again, turning that awareness piece into then the active piece. I completely agree with you. I think, you know, I used to always say to people that, and I don't go back on what I said before, but I used to always say when I worked with clients, you know, you should be telling people how inclusive you are when you're advertising for roles, for example. You know, we value inclusion because of X, Y, and Z. But I think that now I'm adding something onto that where you need to show people that you're inclusive. So it's one thing to tell them, but it's another thing to prove it. So showing people by your attitude, by your values, by your, you know, just your daily behavior within your business, that you are, that it's not just something that you're saying, it's something that you're living on a daily basis. And again, it doesn't have to be, if it can be massive steps, and that's brilliant, but it doesn't necessarily have to be massive steps, massive gestures. It can be those small gestures that show to people and prove to people that actually what you're doing is because it's what you want to do. It's not just because, in quotes, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and adding to that a little bit, Effie, just to, again, if you're engaging with your current workforce, you can demonstrate to customers, to future employees or candidates for roles, that you know what, you can promote and demonstrate that you care. So you're saying, we actively want to improve and sustain well-being, be it physical, be it mental health. That in itself, engaging and just saying that, can open people up to think, oh, that's an organisation I would be like to work for because they actually care about my well-being. And something as simple as that, you know, what can we do to support anyone in a situation, not just disability? We all have areas where we shine and where maybe we need some guidance, and that all starts with opening up the question.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I think we should leave it there, Sarah.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much for joining us today again. Thank you very much to the participants for coming along as well. I hope this has been helpful. If you do have any follow-up questions, please do drop me an email and I'll share it with Sarah. Thank you very much, Layla, as well.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone soon. Bye.
Bye, guys. Cheers. Okay.